What does it take for a government to lock away the truth for half a century? What kind of event is so devastating, so morally complex, that those who witnessed it decided the world wasn't ready to know? On March 16, 1968, something happened in a small Vietnamese village that would challenge everything Americans thought they knew about honor, duty, and the nature of war itself. The archives remained sealed until 2003, long after the men who gave the orders had grown old, long after the soldiers who pulled the triggers had tried to forget. But some truths refused to stay buried, no matter how deep the grave. The village was called My Lai. Before that spring morning, it was just another collection of thatched huts and rice paddies in Quang Ngai province, home to farmers who had lived through French colonialism, Japanese occupation, and years of American intervention. By noon, it would become a name that would haunt the American conscience for generations. This is not a story about heroes, though it involves men who once believed they were. This is not a story with easy answers, though many have tried to provide them. This is a story about what happens when the machinery of war strips away the thin veneer of civilization, when good men do unspeakable things, and when a nation must confront the monster staring back from the mirror. The question isn't just what happened in that village. The question is how it happened, why it was hidden, and what it reveals about the darkest corners of the human soul when placed under the pressures of combat, fear, and dehumanization. The Vietnam War had been grinding on for years by 1968, a conflict that had begun with advisors and escalated into a full-scale American military commitment. The Tet Offensive had just shocked the American public, revealing that despite official assurances of progress, the enemy remained strong, organized, and capable of striking anywhere, anytime. In Quang Ngai province, the war had been particularly brutal. The region was considered a Viet Cong stronghold, and American forces had suffered steady casualties from mines, booby traps, and ambushes. Trust was impossible. Farmers by day could be fighters by night, and the line between civilian and combatant had blurred into non-existence. Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment, 11th Brigade of the 23rd Infantry Division had been operating in this hostile environment for months. They had lost men to invisible enemies, watched their friends stepped on mines that tore bodies apart, and grown increasingly frustrated by an enemy they rarely saw but constantly feared. The company was composed largely of young draftees, many barely out of their teens, thrust into a war they didn't fully understand, in a place where nothing made sense according to the rules they had been taught. Captain Ernest Medina commanded Charlie Company, a career officer who had risen through the ranks and carried the weight of keeping his men alive while completing their missions. His superior officers were pressuring him for results, for body counts, for tangible proof that they were winning this unwinnable war. Intelligence reports suggested that the 48th Viet Cong Battalion was operating in the area around My Lai, and that the village itself served as a staging area for enemy operations. The civilians, intelligence claimed, would be gone to market by the time the Americans arrived. Anyone remaining would be Viet Cong or Viet Cong sympathizers. Lieutenant William Calley led the 1st Platoon. At 24 years old, he was a product of a rushed officer candidate school program designed to fill the Army's desperate need for junior officers. His training had been abbreviated, his experience limited, and his understanding of the laws of war superficial at best. He was not a natural leader, not a tactical genius, not particularly brave or particularly cowardly. He was ordinary, which makes what happened next all the more terrifying. If William Calley could become a mass murderer, then perhaps anyone could, given the right circumstances, the right pressures, the right erosion of moral boundaries. The night before the operation, Captain Medina held a briefing. What exactly he said would become a matter of fierce dispute, a he said, she said that would echo through courtrooms and historical analyses for decades. Some soldiers would later testify that Medina gave explicit orders to kill everything that moved, to burn the village to the ground, to take revenge for their fallen comrades. Others would claim the orders were ambiguous, subject to interpretation, lost in the fog of anger and frustration that permeated the unit. Medina himself would later deny giving any order to kill civilians, claiming he only authorized the destruction of livestock, food supplies, and structures that could support the enemy. But intentions and orders often matter less than actions and results, and the results would speak for themselves in blood. The broader context of the Vietnam War itself shaped every aspect of what would happen at My Lai. This was not a conventional war with front lines and uniformed armies facing each other across clearly defined battlefields. This was counterinsurgency warfare, where the enemy blended into the population, where victory could not be measured by territory gained or lost, where the metrics of success had been reduced to the grotesque arithmetic of body counts. The Pentagon demanded numbers, quantifiable proof that the war was being won, and so field commanders delivered numbers, sometimes without asking too many questions about where those numbers came from or what they actually represented. The doctrine of attrition that governed American strategy in Vietnam created perverse incentives throughout the military hierarchy. Officers were promoted based on the body counts their units achieved. Units that killed more enemy soldiers were considered more effective, regardless of how those kills were achieved or whether the dead were actually enemy soldiers. In an environment where success was measured solely by the number of bodies produced, the temptation to inflate numbers, to count civilian casualties as enemy kills, or to create body counts through indiscriminate violence was always present. Quang Ngai Province had been designated a free fire zone in many areas, meaning that anyone found in these zones could be considered hostile and engaged without warning. The logic was that civilians had been warned to leave, and any Vietnamese remaining must be Viet Cong. But the reality was far more complex. Many civilians had nowhere to go, or couldn't leave their ancestral lands, or didn't receive the warnings, or didn't understand that their continued presence would mark them for death. The free fire zone policy essentially gave soldiers permission to shoot first and ask questions never, a recipe for civilian casualties that would be counted as enemy dead. The men of Charlie Company had not started as monsters. They had been sons and brothers, high school graduates and college dropouts, young men who had grown up in the relatively prosperous America of the 1950s and early 1960s. They had watched John Wayne movies and believed in American exceptionalism, in the righteousness of their cause, in the clear distinction between good guys and bad guys. Vietnam would teach them that the world was not a Hollywood script. Boot camp had stripped them down and rebuilt them as soldiers, teaching them to follow orders without question, to see the enemy as less than human, to survive by being harder and meaner than the other side. But nothing in their training had prepared them for the psychological warfare of Vietnam, where the enemy looked like everyone else, where women and children could be carrying grenades, where the very ground beneath their feet could explode without warning. The months leading up to My Lai had been particularly brutal for Charlie Company. They had walked through rice paddies and jungles, never knowing when death would come. They had seen their friends killed by mines that left nothing to send home in a coffin. They had been taught to hate the Viet Cong, to see all Vietnamese as potential enemies, to view the population as complicit in every American death. The dehumanization was not accidental. It was systematic, a necessary component of asking young men to kill other human beings who had never personally wronged them. Lieutenant Calley had struggled with leadership from the beginning. His men neither particularly respected nor feared him. He had achieved his rank not through demonstrated competence, but through the Army's desperate need for officers. In the field, he often deferred to his non-commissioned officers, the experienced sergeants who actually knew how to fight. But he was insecure, eager to prove himself, desperate to be seen as a real soldier rather than a placeholder with lieutenant's bars. The soldiers of Charlie Company came from diverse backgrounds, united only by their age, their gender, and the circumstance that had brought them to Vietnam. Some had enlisted seeking adventure or following family traditions of military service. Most had been drafted, pulled from civilian lives and thrust into a war they barely understood. They had been working in factories, attending college, starting families when the draft notice arrived. Within months, they found themselves carrying rifles through Vietnamese villages, tasked with fighting an enemy they couldn't identify and winning a war nobody could define. The training these young men received was focused almost entirely on tactical skills: how to shoot, how to move, how to communicate under fire. Very little attention was paid to the laws of armed conflict, the treatment of civilians, or the moral complexities of counterinsurgency warfare. The Geneva Conventions were mentioned in passing, if at all. The idea that a soldier had not just the right, but the obligation to refuse an unlawful order was barely covered. The emphasis was on obedience, on following orders, on trusting that officers knew what they were doing and had the soldiers' best interests at heart. What made the situation even more volatile was the rotation system used in Vietnam. Unlike previous wars where units deployed together, trained together and fought together for the duration, Vietnam used individual replacement. Soldiers arrived and departed based on their personal 12-month tour, meaning that units had constantly changing composition, with experienced soldiers rotating out and green replacements arriving. This system undermined unit cohesion, made it harder to develop trust and shared values, and meant that institutional knowledge about how to operate ethically in a counterinsurgency environment was constantly being lost. Charlie Company had suffered particularly heavy casualties in the months before My Lai. In February 1968, just weeks before the massacre, the company had lost several men to mines and booby traps in operations around the same area. These were not clean deaths on a battlefield, but horrific mutilations. Men stepping on mines that blew their legs off, men triggered booby traps that sent shrapnel tearing through their bodies, men killed by an enemy they never saw and could never strike back against. The psychological impact of losing friends to invisible weapons, of watching men die screaming, of feeling constantly vulnerable and unable to protect themselves cannot be overstated. The frustration was compounded by the rules of engagement that governed their operations. Soldiers were told they needed positive identification before engaging targets, that they couldn't just shoot anyone who looked suspicious. But in practice, determining who was an enemy combatant was nearly impossible. The Viet Cong wore no uniforms, carried no identification, and blended seamlessly into the civilian population. The same farmer working in a rice paddy during the day might be planting mines along the trail at night. The woman selling fruit at the market might be a Viet Cong intelligence agent. The child waving at passing soldiers might be a lookout signaling their position to ambush teams. This impossible situation created enormous stress and a deep sense of paranoia. Soldiers learned to trust no one, to view every Vietnamese civilian as a potential threat, to see kindness or friendliness as possible deception. The psychological distance between viewing all Vietnamese with suspicion and viewing all Vietnamese as legitimate targets was shorter than anyone wanted to admit. Once the dehumanization was complete, once the Vietnamese were no longer seen as individual human beings with lives and families, but simply as gooks who were all collectively responsible for American casualties, the stage was set for atrocity. The intelligence briefing before the My Lai operation had been clear. They would finally get a chance to engage the enemy in a real fight, not just chasing shadows through the jungle. The 48th Viet Cong Battalion would be there, armed and ready. Charlie Company would have the opportunity to strike back, to inflict casualties on an enemy that had been bleeding them for months. The prospect of actual combat, of striking a blow against the faceless enemy, filled many of the soldiers with a mixture of fear and anticipation. They loaded into helicopters in the early morning darkness, armed with M16 rifles, machine guns, grenades, and the accumulated rage of months in hell. As the helicopters lifted off and headed toward My Lai, the soldiers believed they were flying into battle. They expected resistance, expected a firefight, expected finally to face the enemy man-to-man, rather than dying to booby traps and snipers. The adrenaline was pumping, the fear was real, and the desire for revenge was palpable. But when the helicopters touched down in the rice paddies outside My Lai at approximately 7:30 a.m., they encountered no resistance. No gunfire greeted them. No enemy soldiers charged their positions. The village was quiet, going about its morning routines, preparing breakfast, tending to children. Old men, women, children, and infants were the primary inhabitants visible that morning. The 48th Viet Cong Battalion was nowhere to be found. The intelligence had been wrong, or the enemy had moved, or perhaps they had never been there at all. What happened next would become one of the most documented atrocities in American military history, preserved in photographs, recorded in testimonies, and seared into the national consciousness as a moment when America lost its moral bearings. The men of Charlie Company began moving through My Lai, and something broke. Whether it was the accumulated stress of months in combat, the disappointment of finding no enemy soldiers to fight, the explicit or implicit orders from their commanders, or the complete erosion of moral boundaries that had been occurring for months, the soldiers began to kill. They gathered villagers into groups, old men who bowed respectfully, women holding babies, children clinging to their mothers. Lieutenant Calley ordered his men to shoot them. Some hesitated, some refused, but many obeyed, emptying magazine after magazine into unarmed civilians who begged for their lives in a language the Americans didn't understand. The M16 rifle, designed to kill enemy soldiers efficiently, proved equally efficient at killing children. The killing was not quick or merciful. It was methodical, systematic, thorough. Soldiers moved from hut to hut, pulling families out, executing them in ditches and rice paddies. Some soldiers raped women before killing them. Some mutilated bodies. Some killed livestock and threw them into wells to poison the water. Some burned the village, setting fire to the thatched roofs and watching the structures that had housed generations collapse into ash. Private First Class Dennis Conti would later testify about seeing Lieutenant Cali push people into a ditch and then open fire on them. Cali, according to multiple witnesses, was the most aggressive killer, personally executing dozens of civilians and ordering his men to do the same. When one soldier refused, saying he wouldn't participate in the murder of unarmed civilians, Cali reportedly threatened him, telling him to follow orders or face consequences. But Cali was not alone. Numerous soldiers participated in the killing, the raping, the burning. The atrocity was not the work of one man, but of many, a collective madness that descended on the unit. The question that would haunt investigators for years was simple, yet profound. How could so many ordinary American boys become mass murderers in the space of a few hours? The testimony of survivors would later paint a horrifying picture of the massacre. Pham Thi Thuan, who was 14 years old at the time, described soldiers entering her home and shooting her family members one by one. She survived by hiding under the bodies of her dead relatives, lying still for hours, while soldiers continued their rampage through the village. Truong Thi Lay, another survivor, recounted soldiers separating families, executing the men first, then the women and children. The accounts were consistent in their horror. Soldiers moving methodically through the village, killing everyone they encountered, showing no mercy to age or gender. The sexual violence that accompanied the massacre added another layer of depravity to the atrocity. Multiple soldiers raped women and girls before executing them. Some survivors described being forced to watch as soldiers assaulted their family members. The combination of sexual violence and murder revealed the complete breakdown of moral restraint, the transformation of soldiers into predators who saw the Vietnamese not as human beings, but as objects to be used and discarded. Some soldiers did resist. Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson, piloting a helicopter over the village, saw what was happening below and was horrified. He watched soldiers shooting civilians, saw bodies piled in ditches, witnessed a captain's casual murder of a wounded woman. Thompson landed his helicopter between the soldiers and a group of fleeing civilians, ordering his door gunner to open fire on the Americans if they tried to shoot the Vietnamese. He then loaded civilians onto his helicopter and flew them to safety. Thompson's actions represented the other side of the human coin, the capacity for moral courage even when surrounded by evil. He filed reports about what he had seen, reports that would eventually lead to an investigation. But in the immediate aftermath, his actions were not celebrated, but condemned by many in his unit who saw him as a traitor for interfering with the operation. The role of Thompson's crew members, Lawrence Colburn and Glenn Andriotta, also deserves recognition. These men supported Thompson's decision to intervene, with Andriotta physically pulling terrified civilians from bunkers and Colburn providing cover with the helicopter's machine gun. They made a collective choice to prioritize their humanity over their orders, to risk court-martial or worse to save lives. Their actions proved that even in the midst of atrocity, moral choice remained possible. The killing lasted for approximately 4 hours. By the time Charlie Company moved on to other objectives, somewhere between 347 and 504 Vietnamese civilians lay dead, the exact number forever uncertain, because record-keeping in the chaos was impossible, and many bodies were never recovered. Entire families were wiped out. Infants were shot in their mothers' arms. Old people who had survived decades of war were executed in their own homes. My Lai had been transformed from a village into a graveyard. The age range of the victims tells its own story. Infants just months old were killed. Toddlers learning to walk were gunned down. School-age children were executed alongside their parents. Elderly villagers who had lived through the French colonial period and Japanese occupation were murdered in the twilight of their lives. Pregnant women were shot, their unborn children dying with them. The massacre spared no one, made no distinction based on age, gender, or circumstance. The physical evidence left behind was overwhelming. Bodies lay in irrigation ditches, along pathways, inside homes. The village's water supply had been contaminated with dead animals. Structures that had stood for generations were reduced to smoldering ruins. The rice paddies that sustained the village's economy were trampled and burned. The destruction was total, not just of human life, but of the entire social and economic infrastructure that had supported the community. The soldiers who participated in the massacre returned to base that day, filed reports claiming they had killed enemy combatants and tried to go on with their war. Many of them, even years later, would struggle to explain their actions, to reconcile the person they had been before that day with the person who had pulled the trigger on unarmed children. Some would claim they were following orders. Some would say they thought everyone in the village was the enemy. Some would admit they simply snapped under the pressure of months in hell. The immediate aftermath within the unit was telling. Some soldiers were troubled by what had happened, disturbed by the killing of civilians, haunted by the faces of the children they had shot. Others seemed unaffected, treating the massacre as just another day's work, another mission completed. Still others celebrated, viewing the high body count as a military success regardless of who those bodies had been. The range of reactions revealed the extent to which moral boundaries had eroded within the unit. The massacre might have remained hidden forever, if not for Ronald Riddenhauer, a helicopter door gunner who heard rumors about what had happened at My Lai and was disturbed enough to investigate. A year after the massacre, after he had left the military, Riddenhauer sent detailed letters to 30 members of Congress, the Pentagon, and the White House, describing what he had learned about the atrocity. His letters forced the army to launch an investigation that would eventually expose the massacre to the American public. Riddenhauer's decision to pursue the truth despite the risks exemplified a different kind of courage than that shown on the battlefield. He knew that whistleblowing could result in retaliation, ostracism, and threats to his personal safety. Military culture values loyalty and silence, and those who break the code of silence are often treated as traitors. But Riddenhauer believed that some truths were too important to remain hidden, that justice for the victims of My Lai was more important than protecting the reputation of the military or the men who had committed the atrocity. The photographs were what made it impossible to deny. Army photographer Ronald Haberle had been with Charlie Company that day, documenting what he thought would be a combat operation. Instead, he photographed the aftermath of a massacre, bodies piled in ditches, dead children sprawled in pathways, the blank faces of the murdered staring at the camera. When these photographs were published in Life magazine and other outlets, the American public was forced to confront visual evidence of what their soldiers had done. Haberle's photographs served as irrefutable evidence of the massacre, but they also raised difficult questions about his role as a witness. He had been present during the killing, had photographed the aftermath, had known what happened, and yet he had initially remained silent. Like many others who witnessed the massacre, Haberle faced a choice between speaking out and protecting his career, between truth and complicity. His eventual decision to release the photographs helped bring the truth to light, but the delay meant that justice would be significantly compromised. The revelation of the My Lai Massacre came at a time when the American public was already deeply divided over the Vietnam War. The Tet Offensive had shattered the illusion of imminent victory. The credibility gap between official statements and battlefield realities had grown into a chasm. The anti-war movement was gaining strength on college campuses and in the streets. The massacre provided ammunition to those who argued that the war itself was immoral, that America had lost its way, that the military had become an instrument of atrocity rather than liberation. The domestic political context shaped how different segments of American society responded to the revelation of My Lai. Anti-war activists seized on the massacre as proof that the war was fundamentally immoral, that American soldiers were committing war crimes, and that the conflict needed to end immediately. Supporters of the war faced a difficult choice. They could acknowledge that a terrible atrocity had occurred and demand accountability, or they could minimize the massacre, claim it was an isolated incident, and argue that revealing it only aided the enemy and undermined troop morale. The Army's investigation, led by Lieutenant General William Pearse, was extensive and damning. The Pearse Commission concluded that the massacre had occurred, that numerous soldiers had participated, that officers had covered it up, and that the command structure had failed at multiple levels. The Commission recommended charges against numerous individuals, from the enlisted men who had pulled the triggers to the officers who had given the orders or failed to stop the killing. The Pearse Commission report ran to thousands of pages and documented failures at every level of the chain of command. The investigation found that Colonel Orrin Henderson, the brigade commander, had received reports about the massacre, and had failed to properly investigate or report them. The commission found that Captain Medina had created the conditions for the massacre through his briefing and had failed to stop the killing once it began. The commission documented how after-action reports had been falsified, how body counts had been inflated, how the truth had been systematically suppressed by officers more concerned with protecting their careers than ensuring justice. But accountability proved elusive. Of the 26 officers and soldiers initially charged with crimes related to My Lai, only one was convicted, Lieutenant William Calley. In March 1971, Calley was found guilty of murdering 22 civilians and sentenced to life in prison with hard labor. The verdict was controversial from the moment it was announced. Some Americans saw Calley as a scapegoat, a junior officer being punished for following orders while his superiors escaped justice. Others saw him as getting exactly what he deserved, a war criminal who had murdered children and deserved to spend the rest of his life behind bars. The trial of Lieutenant Calley revealed the complexities of establishing individual criminal responsibility in situations involving mass atrocities. Calley's defense argued that he was following orders, that he believed the orders were lawful, that he was operating in the fog of war where split-second decisions had to be made. The prosecution countered that the orders to kill unarmed civilians were obviously unlawful, that any reasonable person would have known they were unlawful, and that soldiers have an obligation to refuse such orders. The jury ultimately sided with the prosecution, finding that Calley had murdered civilians and that following orders was not a valid defense. The controversy intensified when President Richard Nixon intervened. Responding to public pressure and his own political calculations, Nixon ordered Calley released from prison to house arrest while his appeals proceeded. The intervention was widely seen as political, an attempt to placate conservative voters who saw Calley as a patriot being persecuted by anti-war activists. Calley would ultimately serve only 3.5 years under house arrest before being released on parole in 1974. Nixon's intervention in the Calley case revealed the extent to which My Lai had become politicized. Conservative commentators argued that Calley was being scapegoated to appease anti-war protesters, that he had done nothing different from thousands of other soldiers, that singling him out for punishment was unfair. Liberal commentators responded that war crimes needed to be punished regardless of political considerations, that Calley's light sentence sent a message that massacring civilians carried little consequence, and that true accountability required punishing not just Calley, but his superiors who had created the conditions for the massacre. The light punishment outraged many observers. Hugh Thompson, the helicopter pilot who had stopped the massacre, was disgusted that the man who had committed mass murder would serve less time than someone convicted of robbery. Anti-war activists pointed to the Calley case as proof that the military justice system was designed to protect war criminals rather than punish them. The perception that justice had not been served would linger for decades. Captain Medina was court-martialed for his role in the massacre, but was acquitted, claiming he had not ordered the killing of civilians and had not been aware of the full extent of what was happening until it was too late. His acquittal meant that no officer above the platoon level was held accountable for the massacre, despite clear evidence that the command climate had contributed to the atrocity and that cover-up efforts had extended up the chain of command. The acquittal of Medina was particularly controversial because multiple soldiers testified that he had given orders that could reasonably be interpreted as authorizing the killing of civilians. The jury apparently accepted Medina's testimony that his orders had been misunderstood, that he had not intended for civilians to be killed, and that he had taken steps to stop the killing once he became aware of its scope. Critics argued that commanders should be held responsible for creating climates that make atrocities possible, even if they don't give explicit orders to commit war crimes. The broader question was how to prevent such atrocities from happening again. The military implemented new training programs focused on the laws of war, emphasizing that soldiers had a duty to disobey unlawful orders, that killing unarmed civilians was never justified, that war crimes would be prosecuted. These reforms were necessary, but arrived too late for the victims of My Lai and raised uncomfortable questions about why such training had not been standard from the beginning. The post-My Lai reforms included mandatory training on the Geneva Conventions, instruction on identifying and refusing unlawful orders, and the creation of new mechanisms for reporting war crimes. The military also reformed its intelligence procedures to reduce the likelihood of operations based on faulty information. Rules of engagement were clarified to emphasize the protection of civilians. The changes represented a genuine attempt to learn from My Lai and prevent future atrocities. Some observers argued that My Lai was not an isolated incident, but rather an extreme example of how the Vietnam War was being fought. The emphasis on body counts as a measure of success had created perverse incentives to inflate enemy casualties and, in some cases, to count civilian deaths as enemy kills. The free fire zones, where anyone in a designated area could be considered hostile, had blurred the lines between combatants and civilians. The use of defoliants like Agent Orange, which destroyed crops and forests without regard for the health of the population, showed a willingness to harm civilians in pursuit of military objectives. Research conducted after the war suggested that My Lai, while extreme, was not entirely unique. Other incidents of civilian casualties that violated the laws of war occurred throughout the Vietnam conflict. Some were the result of operational mistakes, such as misdirected artillery fire or bombing errors. Others involved deliberate killing of civilians under circumstances that suggested war crimes. The full scope of such incidents may never be known because many were never reported, investigated, or documented. The My Lai Massacre became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the Vietnam War, a crystallization of the moral bankruptcy of a conflict that had lost its purpose, if it had ever had one. For the anti-war movement, My Lai was proof that the war was not only unwinnable but immoral, that American soldiers were not liberators but oppressors, that the entire enterprise needed to end immediately. For those who supported the war, My Lai was an embarrassment, an aberration that did not represent the broader conduct of American forces and was being exploited by anti-war activists to undermine the military and the nation. The impact of My Lai on military morale and public support for the war cannot be overstated. Soldiers serving in Vietnam found themselves viewed with suspicion by civilians back home, treated as potential war criminals rather than heroes serving their country. The traditional respect for military service eroded as the public struggled to reconcile the image of American soldiers as defenders of freedom with the reality of what had happened at My Lai. Veterans returning from Vietnam faced hostility and protests rather than parades and gratitude. The question of how My Lai happened requires examining the systematic failures that made such an atrocity possible. The massacre was not the result of one bad officer or one poorly trained unit, but rather the product of a military culture that had lost its moral compass in the crucible of an unwinnable war. The dehumanization of the enemy was central to the problem. From the moment soldiers arrived in Vietnam, they were taught to see the Vietnamese as gooks, dinks, and slopes, terms designed to strip away their humanity and make killing psychologically easier. When the enemy looks like the civilian population, and the civilian population cannot be trusted, the logical endpoint is to view everyone as a potential threat, everyone as disposable, everyone as less than fully human. The psychological process of dehumanization has been studied extensively by scholars examining war crimes and genocide. Research shows that when soldiers are trained to view the enemy as subhuman, as less deserving of moral consideration, as fundamentally different from themselves, the barriers to committing atrocities weaken. Language plays a crucial role in this process. The use of derogatory terms reduces cognitive dissonance, making it easier for soldiers to kill without experiencing severe psychological distress. The command climate of the American Division, the unit to which Charlie Company belonged, was notoriously poor. Officers were focused on body counts and career advancement rather than the welfare of their soldiers or the protection of civilians. The pressure to produce results, to show progress in a war where progress was nearly impossible to measure, created incentives for recklessness and shortcuts. When officers signaled, explicitly or implicitly, that civilian casualties were acceptable collateral damage, they created the conditions for atrocity. The training of junior officers like Lieutenant Calley was woefully inadequate. The rapid expansion of the military for Vietnam required producing officers quickly, and the quality of that training suffered. Many lieutenants arrived in Vietnam with barely adequate tactical skills and almost no education in the laws of war, the ethical obligations of soldiers, or the moral complexities of counterinsurgency warfare. Calley was not an aberration in this respect, but rather a typical product of a system that prioritized quantity over quality. The psychological toll of guerrilla warfare cannot be underestimated. The soldiers of Charlie Company had been operating in an environment where death could come at any moment from any direction. The enemy was invisible, the population hostile or indifferent, and every step could trigger a mine. The constant stress, the accumulated losses, the inability to strike back at a visible enemy created a pressure cooker of rage and frustration that exploded at My Lai. Combat stress and its impact on moral decision-making is now better understood than it was in 1968. Research has shown that prolonged exposure to combat, particularly in counterinsurgency environments where the enemy is difficult to identify, can lead to psychological conditions that impair judgment and increase the likelihood of atrocities. Soldiers experiencing combat stress may develop hypervigilance, viewing everyone as a threat. They may experience emotional numbing that makes it difficult to empathize with civilians. They may develop a sense of fatalism that undermines their commitment to moral behavior. But explanations are not excuses. Understanding how My Lai happened does not diminish the moral culpability of those who participated. Thousands of other American soldiers operated in the same environment, faced the same pressures, suffered the same losses, and did not commit massacres. The capacity to maintain moral boundaries even under extreme stress is what separates soldiers from murderers, and many of the men of Charlie Company failed that test. The cover-up was in some ways as troubling as the massacre itself. Officers up and down the chain of command received reports about what had happened at My Lai and chose to ignore them, downplay them, or actively suppress them. The initial after-action reports from the operation claimed that 128 Viet Cong had been killed in combat, a complete fabrication. When Hugh Thompson filed his report about what he had witnessed, he was met with hostility and threats rather than gratitude for exposing a war crime. The institutional response to Thompson's initial report reveals how deeply the culture of cover-up permeated the military hierarchy. Rather than immediately launching an investigation and securing the crime scene, officers worked to suppress the information and intimidate witnesses. Thompson was told to keep quiet, warned that pursuing the matter would damage his career, and treated as if he were the problem rather than the soldiers who had committed the massacre. This response sent a clear message throughout the military. Reporting war crimes would be punished, not rewarded. The military's institutional instinct was to protect itself rather than seek justice. Admitting that American soldiers had committed a massacre would be a public relations disaster, would give ammunition to the anti-war movement, would call into question the conduct of the entire war. Better to bury the truth, to discredit the whistleblowers, to hope that the story would go away. This instinct to cover up rather than confront would damage the military's credibility far more than an honest accounting of what had happened and a commitment to justice. The sealing of the archives until 2003 was part of this pattern of concealment. By classifying documents related to the massacre and its investigation, the government ensured that the full truth would not emerge for decades, until most of the participants were elderly or dead, until the political climate had changed, until the Vietnam War had faded into history. The delay meant that many questions would never be fully answered, that many perpetrators would never be held accountable, that justice would remain forever incomplete. When the archives were finally opened, they revealed the extent to which the military and the government had known about the massacre and had worked to minimize its impact. Documents showed that officers had been aware of similar incidents in other units, suggesting that My Lai was not as unique as the official narrative claimed. Reports indicated that the command climate in the American division had been toxic, with officers focused more on advancing their careers than on the ethical conduct of their troops. The newly released documents also revealed the extent of the cover-up conspiracy. Multiple officers had coordinated their stories, agreed to falsify reports, and worked to suppress evidence. Some documents showed that officers had threatened witnesses, destroyed evidence, and lied to investigators. The paper trail revealed a systematic effort to protect the military's reputation at the expense of justice for the victims. The comparison to other atrocities throughout history is inevitable and instructive. The Holocaust was carried out by ordinary men who had been transformed into killers through ideology, dehumanization, and the structures of authority. The rape of Nanking saw Japanese soldiers commit horrific atrocities against Chinese civilians, driven by a combination of racist ideology and the breakdown of military discipline. The Rwandan genocide demonstrated how quickly neighbors could turn into murderers when primed by propaganda and fear. My Lai fits into this pattern of ordinary people committing extraordinary evil. The soldiers of Charlie Company were not uniquely evil, not psychopaths or sadists. but rather ordinary young men who had been placed in extraordinary circumstances and had made terrible choices. This is both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it means that America did not produce a unit of monsters. Terrifying because it means that given the right circumstances, almost any group of soldiers might do the same thing. The philosophical question at the heart of My Lai is whether morality can survive in the crucible of war. Can soldiers maintain their humanity when everything around them is designed to strip it away? Can armies wage war ethically when the nature of modern warfare blurs every boundary and makes every civilian a potential threat? Can nations ask young men to kill and be killed without accepting that some of them will cross lines that should never be crossed? The optimistic answer is that yes, morality can survive war, because most soldiers most of the time do maintain ethical boundaries even under extreme stress. Hugh Thompson proved that moral courage was possible even at My Lai, even when surrounded by atrocity. The soldiers who refused to participate in the killing, who were sickened by what they saw, who later became whistleblowers, demonstrated that the capacity for moral action exists even in the worst circumstances. The pessimistic answer is that war by its nature undermines morality, that asking humans to kill other humans inevitably leads to atrocity, that the best we can hope for is to minimize the damage rather than prevent it entirely. My Lai happened not despite the rules and training, but because the reality of war overwhelms such artificial constraints, because when survival is at stake and the enemy is everywhere, moral philosophy becomes a luxury that few can afford. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. War does create conditions that make atrocity more likely, but it does not make it inevitable. Training, leadership, accountability, and a strong ethical culture within military units can prevent most atrocities most of the time. But perfection is impossible, and as long as wars are fought, there will be My Lais, moments when the machinery of violence escapes control and ordinary people do monstrous things. The legacy of My Lai extends beyond the immediate question of what happened in that village. The massacre forced Americans to confront uncomfortable truths about their military, their war, and their nation. It challenged the myth of American exceptionalism, the belief that Americans were inherently more moral than other peoples, that American soldiers would never commit the kinds of atrocities associated with Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan. My Lai proved that no nation, no matter how democratic or how wealthy, is immune to moral failure when it wages war. The impact on military culture was profound and long-lasting. The reforms implemented after My Lai changed how the military trained soldiers, how it selected and trained officers, how it investigated allegations of war crimes, and how it thought about the moral dimensions of warfare. The emphasis on the laws of war, on the obligation to refuse unlawful orders, on protecting civilians became central to military training in a way it had not been before. The village of My Lai exists today, rebuilt on the ashes of that March morning in 1968. A memorial stands where the killing happened, listing the names of the dead, preserving the memory of children who never grew up and families that were extinguished in a single morning. Vietnamese visitors come to pay their respects, to remember, to ensure that the world does not forget what happened. William Calley lived quietly in Georgia after his release from house arrest, running a jewelry store, avoiding publicity, rarely speaking about the massacre. He offered a public apology in 2009, saying he was sorry for the loss of life at My Lai, though he continued to maintain that he had been following orders. He died in 2024, having lived a full life that his victims never got to experience. His death closed a chapter, but did not provide closure. The questions about responsibility, about justice, about how to prevent future My Lais remain as urgent as ever. Hugh Thompson, the helicopter pilot who stopped the massacre, was eventually honored for his courage, receiving the Soldier's Medal in 1998, 30 years after the event. He spent much of his later life speaking about the importance of moral courage, of the duty to disobey unlawful orders, of the obligation to protect the innocent even when doing so means defying your own side. He died in 2006, remembered as a hero who had shown what one person with courage could accomplish even in the midst of atrocity. Thompson's legacy serves as a counterpoint to the darkness of My Lai, proof that moral choice remains possible even in the most morally compromised situations. The men who participated in the massacre and survived have lived with their choices for more than 5 decades. Some have expressed remorse, acknowledging the horror of what they did. and struggling with the memory of that day. Others have remained silent, taking their secrets to the grave. Still others have defended their actions, insisting they were soldiers following orders in a war where the rules were unclear and the enemy indistinguishable from civilians. The variety of responses reflects the complexity of moral responsibility in war and the different ways individuals cope with participation in atrocity. The impact of My Lai on American culture and policy cannot be overstated. The massacre contributed to the erosion of public support for the Vietnam War, reinforced doubts about American moral leadership, and prompted reforms in military training and the laws of war. The image of American soldiers murdering children shattered the myth of the United States as an inherently righteous nation whose military only fought for noble causes. The cognitive dissonance between America's self-image and the reality of My Lai forced a reckoning with the darker aspects of American power. The cultural legacy of My Lai appears in literature, film, music, and art. The massacre has been the subject of countless books, documentaries, and academic studies. Artists have grappled with how to represent the horror of what happened without exploiting it. The massacre has become a reference point in discussions about war crimes, about military ethics, about the responsibilities of citizenship in a democracy that wages war. The phrase My Lai has entered the language as shorthand for military atrocity, for the failure of moral boundaries in war. The lessons of My Lai remain relevant decades later. In the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, American forces faced similar challenges of counterinsurgency, of distinguishing combatants from civilians, of operating in environments where trust was impossible and death could come from any direction. Incidents like the Haditha killings in Iraq showed that the capacity for atrocity had not disappeared, that the pressures of guerrilla warfare still could push soldiers beyond moral boundaries. The Haditha incident in 2005, where Marines killed 24 Iraqi civilians in response to a roadside bombing, demonstrated that the lessons of My Lai had not been fully learned or internalized. While the military's response to Haditha was faster and more transparent than its initial response to My Lai, the fact that such an incident could occur at all, nearly 40 years after My Lai, raised troubling questions about whether the reforms implemented after Vietnam had been sufficient. The military has worked to internalize the lessons of My Lai, emphasizing ethical training, clarifying the laws of war, creating systems to report and investigate potential war crimes. The doctrine of counterinsurgency that emerged in the 2000s explicitly recognized that protecting civilians was not just a moral imperative, but a strategic necessity, that winning hearts and minds required treating the population with respect rather than viewing everyone as a potential enemy. Counterinsurgency doctrine emphasized that every civilian killed created new enemies, that indiscriminate violence was not just immoral, but counterproductive. But systems and training can only do so much. The fundamental challenge remains unchanged. War places human beings in situations that test the limits of morality, that create pressures and incentives to do terrible things, that blur the lines between right and wrong. As long as nations wage war, there will be moments when soldiers face choices between obeying orders and maintaining their humanity, between following their training and following their conscience, between surviving and remaining true to their values. The role of technology in modern warfare adds new dimensions to these moral challenges. Drone warfare, for instance, creates physical and psychological distance between the operator and the target, potentially making it easier to kill without fully confronting the humanity of those being killed. Precision weapons reduce but do not eliminate civilian casualties, and the availability of such weapons may create unrealistic expectations about the possibility of clean, surgical warfare. Surveillance technology makes it easier to track and target individuals, but also creates new possibilities for mistakes and abuses. The archives were sealed until 2003, not because the government was ashamed of what had happened at My Lai, though it should have been, but because acknowledging the full scope of the massacre and the cover-up would have undermined support for the war and raised uncomfortable questions about accountability and command responsibility. By the time the documents were released, the Vietnam War had been over for nearly 3 decades. Most of the principals were elderly or dead, and the political climate had changed enough that the revelations caused barely a ripple in the national consciousness. This is the final tragedy of My Lai. Not just that it happened, not just that it was covered up, but that when the truth finally emerged, the nation had moved on, the perpetrators had lived full lives, and justice remained forever incomplete. The victims stayed dead, the survivors carried their trauma into old age, and the world learned once again a lesson it should never have needed to learn: that good men can do evil things, that orders are not an excuse for atrocity, and that the cost of forgetting history is to risk repeating it. The survivors of My Lai continue to live with the psychological and physical scars of that morning. Many lost their entire families, parents, siblings, children, all murdered in a few hours. The trauma of surviving when everyone you loved was killed, of hiding among the bodies of your family, of living with the knowledge that the world failed to protect you, is difficult to imagine. Some survivors have spoken publicly about their experiences, keeping the memory of My Lai alive and demanding that the world remember. Others have chosen silence, finding the pain too great to revisit. The Vietnamese government has maintained the My Lai Memorial as a site of historical memory and as a reminder of the costs of war. School groups visit to learn about what happened. Foreign visitors come to pay respects and confront the reality of the massacre. The memorial serves both as a specific commemoration of those who died and as a broader symbol of civilian suffering in war. The Vietnamese perspective on My Lai emphasizes both the specific atrocity and the broader pattern of violence that civilians experienced throughout the American war. The question posed at the beginning remains: what does it take for a government to lock away the truth for half a century? The answer is simple and damning. It takes the calculation that the truth is more dangerous than the lie, that accountability is more damaging than impunity, that the national self-image is more important than justice for the dead. The archives were sealed because My Lai revealed something about America that the nation was not ready to confront, that its soldiers were capable of evil, that its military had failed to prevent or properly punish that evil, and that the mythology of American exceptionalism was built on foundations far less solid than anyone wanted to admit. What happened in that village was not complicated. Soldiers murdered hundreds of unarmed civilians, including children and infants, in an orgy of violence that lasted for hours. Why it happened is more complex, involving the pressures of guerrilla warfare, inadequate training and leadership, the dehumanization of the enemy, and the accumulated stress of months in combat. Why it was hidden is easiest to understand, because telling the truth would have been inconvenient, embarrassing and damaging to the war effort and the reputations of those responsible. The sealing of the archives until 2003 ensured that the fullest accounting of My Lai would come only after most Americans had stopped paying attention, after the political consequences had been neutralized by time, after justice had become impossible. It was a calculated decision to prioritize institutional protection over moral reckoning, to value the reputation of the military over the memory of the dead, to let time and distance do what honesty and accountability could not. My Lai stands as a permanent reminder that the capacity for atrocity lives within all human societies, that no nation is immune to moral failure, that the difference between civilization and barbarism is thinner than anyone wants to believe. The village that was destroyed in a single morning in 1968 continues to haunt the American conscience, a ghost that cannot be exorcised by explanations or excuses, a wound that cannot be healed by the passage of time, a truth that remains true no matter how long it was hidden. The men who were there, both the killers and the heroes, are nearly all gone now, taking their memories and their guilt and their trauma to the grave. The documents are unsealed, available for researchers and historians to examine, to analyze, to incorporate into the historical record. But documents cannot resurrect the dead, cannot undo what was done, cannot restore what was lost in that village on that terrible morning. The lesson of My Lai, if there is one, is not that war makes monsters of men, though it can, but that ordinary men can become monsters when placed in circumstances that erode moral boundaries and when leadership fails to maintain ethical standards. The lesson is not that following orders excuses atrocity, it does not, but that creating a military culture that values obedience over morality makes atrocity more likely. The lesson is not that all soldiers are potential war criminals, the vast majority are not, but that without constant vigilance, without proper training, without accountability, the possibility of atrocity remains ever present. My Lai happened. The archives were sealed. The truth eventually emerged. Justice was never fully served. And somewhere in Vietnam, in a rebuilt village that bears the scars of history, a memorial stands to remind the world that on March 16, 1968, something unspeakable occurred, something that those in power tried to hide, something that reveals uncomfortable truths about war, morality, and human nature. The question is not whether it could happen again. History suggests that it can, and likely will. The question is what we will do to prevent it, to recognize it, to stop it when it begins. Because the capacity for My Lai exists wherever soldiers fight, wherever the lines between combatant and civilian blur, wherever leaders fail to maintain moral boundaries, wherever ordinary people are placed in extraordinary circumstances and asked to do inhuman things. The archives can be unsealed, the documents can be read, the history can be written, but the fundamental challenge remains: how to wage war without becoming the very thing we claim to be fighting against, how to maintain humanity in the most inhumane of human activities, how to ensure that My Lai remains a historical aberration rather than a recurring tragedy. That village, those people, that morning in March, they matter not because they were unique, but because they were not. Because what happened there could happen anywhere. Because the distance between soldier and murderer is shorter than we want to believe. Because the truth about war is uglier than the myths we prefer to tell. The archives were sealed until 2003, because the truth was too terrible to confront in the moment, because time and distance were needed before the nation could face what had been done in its name. But now the archives are open, the truth is known, and the question remains: what will we do with this knowledge? Will we learn from it, or will we file it away as ancient history, irrelevant to modern conflicts and contemporary challenges? Will we honor the dead by ensuring it never happens again, or will we wait for the next village, the next massacre, the next set of archives to be sealed? My Lai happened because people failed to lead, failed to refuse unlawful orders, failed to protect the innocent, failed to tell the truth, failed to demand justice. The sealing of the archives until 2003 was another failure, a failure of courage, a failure of honesty, a failure to trust the American people with the truth about what had been done in their name. The opening of those archives decades later does not undo those failures, but it does provide an opportunity to learn from them, to do better, to ensure that the next time soldiers face similar pressures and similar choices, the outcome will be different. The village was called My Lai. Before March 16, 1968, it was just another small hamlet in Vietnam. After that day, it became a symbol of everything that can go wrong when war strips away morality, when leadership fails, when ordinary people do monstrous things. The archives were sealed until 2003, but the truth could not be buried forever. Now it stands in the light, undeniable and damning, a permanent reminder that the price of freedom includes confronting the darkest chapters of our history, learning from them, and committing to do better. The dead of My Lai deserve nothing less. The future demands nothing less. And the truth, however long it was hidden, settles like dust over everything, impossible to ignore, impossible to escape, impossible to forget.